So, the SolarWinds breach was discovered and disclosed by FireEye last year, and it was obvious that this would be a game changer. Um, Kevin and his team found an artifact in their network, and they pursued it, and they pursued it, and they pursued it. They didn't take I don't know for an answer, and they ran it to ground, and sure enough, they found SolarWinds. I think it's a great story, and I'm looking forward to hearing that next.
Yeah, Rick, thank you. It's my pleasure to welcome FireEye CEO Kevin Mandia, who's joining us in conversation with KKR's Global Institute Chairman and Cipher brief expert, General Dave Petraeus. It was something that, obviously, Kevin, this could not have been an easy decision in the way that FireEye handled this, but I'm looking forward to hearing both of you dig in on this. Let me just ask quickly, do we have General Petraeus?
Yes, he's coming in.
Okay, he is coming on right now. So we'll give him just 1 second. Kevin, you're joining us in from the West Coast, where FireEye headquarters is, or?
I am actually in Northern Virginia right now, and I'm, General Petraeus wore a tie too. So
you
we
could have
knew
been here in person.
on us seeing ties in a year, so we decided to be that duo and wear ties.
Well, gentlemen, welcome. I'm really looking forward to this. Rick and I are just going to turn off cameras for a bit and let the two of you dig in, and then we will pop back in for questions whenever you're ready. General, I'm sorry, you may be on mute.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. It's great to be with you all, and especially great to be with Kevin. We go back quite a ways, and important to note that Kevin started out in the Air Force. He was a cyber officer before they were probably called cyber officers, spent time at NSA, left government to found his own company, Mandia Corporation. And I actually want to start out talking about that a bit, Kevin, because as I have often noted, one of the greatest services of all time in the cyber business, at least in the past decade or so, was Mandia Corporation's identification and disclosure of the extent of the Chinese PLAs, the People's Liberation Army version of NSA, conduct of industrial espionage. And this was known, those of us who were in the field at that time. Obviously, I was in my last government position, we were aware of what was going on, but of course there was always a concern about disclosing sources and methods. And it was Mandia Corporation, therefore, that through the New York Times, an extraordinary expose, laid all of that out. And so, Kevin, why don't you start by talking a bit about how Mandia Corporation did that? Because that actually is part of the way towards SolarWinds, which is another amazing coup.
Yeah, so General, that's going back 8 years, but I think it was right around February of 2013 when we went public. And if I recall correctly at that time, first and foremost, Mandia was a lot of former military folks. So we understand that in security, you protect the nation, and you have to be kind to the sovereign nation that hosts your company. And there was just a lot of things going on at that time, General, where you could tell there was an intolerance amongst the victim CEOs. We had responded to PLA Unit 61398 over 140 times. And that's a lot, over a 3-year period where we're figuring out what happened, what to do about it. At that time, also, Congressman Mike Rogers was pushing for an information sharing bill, which we believed in. At least to protect the nation, you should have first responders sharing intel so you can do shields up when something bad's happening. So lots of different factors, but part of it was on the inside, all the former military folks saying, we got to do something. The CEO saying, what's going on with China and why isn't the government having some kind of conversation about rules of engagement? And Mike Rogers pushing for the information sharing just felt like a catalyst. And by the way, we picked it out of a hat. We had APT Group 4, which we think is the Chinese Navy. We went to APT Group 1, and we have boring names, by the way. We don't have Fluffy Snuggle Duck or Huggy Bear. We just had integers for the different groups that we got attribution for. We went with APT Group 1 because we just felt we could withstand their offense against us once we kind of go public and expose them. But we almost went with APT Group 4, but we had a little bit less data on them. So anyway, in a nutshell, we thought that we could be a useful tool to promote bilateral conversation, both in information sharing as well as between two nations, to have a discussion on rules of engagement.
And you certainly did do that. Of course, eventually that all led, the awareness of that throughout the body public eventually led the administration to the Sunnyland Summit, where, of course, the Chinese leader, President Xi, by that point in time, committed to reducing very substantially the aspect of PLA activities that was industrial espionage, not necessarily, say, the spying that is done in any event. But just to, before we leave this, what was remarkable about that was that you just didn't identify the location, the unit, what was going on. You identified individual hackers, and you were even able to turn on the cameras on their computers so that you had photographs to go with that, having verified who they were from their social media. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so we never reached back, and I know David Sanger published in his book that we hacked back. We never did that. I'm former law enforcement. We don't believe in doing that, and we never have. What we did, though, is in plain view to one of our network security monitoring, we were getting full packet capture of one of their attackers who was in their military, and he, like many young people, wanted to meet women from America. So what he was doing in our wiretap, where we were legally there monitoring for one of our customers, he was coming through the Great Firewall of China to hack the United States. And where we were monitoring, he was doing Gmail and he was doing Facebook. So what we actually saw was him posting his own photos to a Facebook wall while he was having discussions with different people here in the United States. So we could ID them. You know, we saw Gmails that were to the point of, today I was given orders to hack so-and-so company. It's such a drag. You know, so we had to translate all the email, but that's where we got those photos that David Sanger refers to in his book. We didn't hack back and turn on a camera. It was the person taking a photo of themselves at their desk and sending to someone that they met in the United States online through email and on a Facebook wall.
Yeah, I did like some of the detail, though, that you did capture as well. That was soldiers doing what soldiers do in any country, which is to complain a bit about their bosses and how hard they were having to work.
Yep.
In any event, obviously, FireEye then purchased Mandiant. It was a great development for you and your team. And in subsequent years, all of a sudden, you find yourself the CEO of FireEye. And fast forward now to this most recent extraordinary accomplishment.
Right.
Tell us a bit about how it was that you discovered what was going on in what we now call SolarWinds.
Well, I can tell you, General, I had a real busy Thursday. And on Friday, I woke up, I did an all hands to my whole company about how we just bought a company that does AI, how we just did a investment from Blackstone. And I didn't even see it on my calendar till after I was done doing all hands with our 3,000 plus employees. And it just said security brief. So I dialed in, and by the way, this is a Friday, and I'm thinking I'm going home and going to bed. I'm going to take an early Friday. And I dial into the security brief, and about 5 minutes into it, I started getting pattern recognition. And I'm not convinced the briefer knew how severe our breach was. But from 1998 to 2000, I spent a whole lot of time doing my forensics for what I would attribute as the Russian SVR. And very quickly in the briefing I was getting, I saw pattern recognition. And somebody once told me the phrase shocked but not surprised. That's kind of how I felt. I knew my Friday was ruined. And 10 minutes into this security briefing I was getting, I asked General Counsel to call a board meeting for later that day. And I call that board meeting the Brace for Impact meeting, because we didn't know a lot, but I knew enough to know we had a professional in our networks, and it would take everything we can bring to bear, period, to figure out what happened and what to do about it. And so all I can tell you is one of my first instincts is in my career, maybe 100 times I've told CEOs during a breach, this is now your day job to address this security issue. In my head, I remember telling myself, this has just become my day job, period. And it did. From the moment I was notified, and within 3 days of that initial briefing, our team's response went to shock and awe. We knew we were up against a great foreign intelligence service when it comes to offense.
How was it that your team first discovered this?
Yeah.
And then how long did it take to discover the magnitude of this? And put that in some perspective, if you could.
So the detection, you always find smoke first, and then you pull threads till you find the fire, or you chase smoke till you find fire. The detection was a severity 0 alert, which in hindsight maybe shouldn't have been a severity 0. We had the detection was a user account used by one of our sales professionals coming in through our VPN on a new cell phone. And that sales professional, from our vantage point, it was like we had an employee register a new device, they self-enrolled it, and then when they came into our network, they had their new iPhone and they had their Duo Mobile code on it. The problem is, one of our security professionals called the salesperson and said, did you enroll a new phone? Because the person had not responded to the email we sent. Hey, is this really you enrolling this new phone? Apparently nobody responds to those emails, and we'd have to change process. But the bottom line is somebody logged in with valid credentials into our network, authenticated into our VPN on a new device. Our security professional called the person on their phone and said, did you register a new device? That person said no. So that means we have an unknown third party circumventing our two-factor authentication with a new device. And that's the initial detection. And then at that point, I kind of, we have a network wired for investigation. That's what our people do. So when I was briefed on that, the challenge I had is that the person was accessing our network right after they got in with that user account. They did some things that required administrative level privileges. So in my first brief, everybody was saying they have admin, but we don't know how. And my answer was they have it because they've been in. And they've chosen to access our network the same way we do. And that's a problem for us. And then we went into a full court press. I call it the amoeba defense, General. Like, we did not gradually increment after that first detection. We put about 100 people on it, and we went full bore and did forensics everywhere. On every single machine that had an endpoint, we started we looked under every rock immediately.
I mean, that is really extraordinary. Number one, of course, it shows still the value of a human, even in a world where you have artificially intelligence enabled endpoint cybersecurity solutions, which I gather did not pick it up.
I think when we look back over SolarWinds and we talk to folks about it, there's blips on the radar, but none of them had context. Why was there a packet going to a certain domain? We have network sensors that capture every packet, so clearly there were indicators. It's just in the onslaught of the attacks hitting you from the internet and the alert volume, without context, a lot of this didn't make any sense. So I'm unaware of, and by the way, just the way the implant worked in SolarWinds, it shut off a lot of different technologies when it executed. It would shut off CrowdStrike, it shut off our endpoint. And so it's just because the implant had system level access, General, it shut off our number one way we would have detected the problem, which was trigger on the malware that they put on that system.
I hope that human operator got a major bonus before the end of the year.
Not yet. No, and in fact, it's interesting. She's one of our newer employees. So I often wonder if an industry vet would have made the call, but somebody new to the job was being thorough. And in hindsight, we look at it, we had policies, you shouldn't be able to self-enroll, but we have a small IT department. And when like a new iPhone comes out, there's a whole bunch of companies who their IT department gets inundated with so many requests, they just go, hey, listen, you can enroll your own device. Recognizing, by the way, to self-enroll, you already have a user ID and passphrase. In this case, the attackers did have that. But they found the accounts that we switched the bits and let people self-enroll, because that was the anomaly, not the norm. And what you learn is that IT over time, you start seeing a drift in your security processes and posture, because so much of your security is being done by IT people that don't really know security. So long story made short, I'm not convinced it should have been a severity 0 alert in our SIM, but it was. And I'm thankful we made a phone call to the individual.
So how big was this in relative terms to, say, other really serious hacks that you've seen over the years? And how worried are you that we have by no means discovered all of the systems and networks and so forth that have been penetrated and gotten the attackers out of them?
Well, I think, General, one of the things I've observed, and I still think even since day one, this was probably the SVR, they do operate with some constraint. They still operate without they don't carpet bomb the internet to hack everybody. And what was different about this one from my perspective is, first, it was a .com FireEye finding them. In my career back in the 90s, they were never found by .com. So if it was the SVR, I haven't seen too many companies find them, period. And that being said, I also believe they don't operate in .com too often. So we've always heard about implants. I think they're a little bit indiscriminate in that when this implant was created, it did get downloaded by over 18,000 companies, but I believe the blast radius is far smaller than that. So I called it stage 1 victims, meaning you downloaded a backdoor into your network unwittingly from the supply chain, SolarWinds, was over 18,000. But in talking to Microsoft and other organizations, we're thinking the blast radius is about 1,000 folks. And then I can tell you the way the group worked at FireEye, one of the reasons I also knew who I thought it was is they were minimizing their collections. They didn't do it wasn't a tank through a cornfield. Like when China gets into a network, they take whole directories without reviewing them. Just let's rar them up and take it. And so it's a tank through a cornfield. When I see economical movement, string searching, almost magical string searching, like how did they know to search for that string or that project name or those people? They came armed with their target, and we saw what they were searching for. And so when you look at the blast radius, it wasn't 18,000 companies, even though that was in harm's way. It was really about 100 that probably had stage 2 human interaction on it. And in those 100, I think what will come to bear is there was a focus by the attackers on very specific information and people.
Last question on this then. The initial entry to get into SolarWinds, to embed this that is then downloaded as part of normal processes, was that a supply chain hardware, or was it a software that emanated from the United States? How was the original penetration established?
So I don't think they know. And as of 2 weeks ago, they didn't know. And I don't know if we'll ever find out. If this is Russian foreign intelligence, I'm very convinced they have 0-day capability, and all electronic evidence is ephemeral. You can delete it if you get to it. So I'm not sure we'll ever know how SolarWinds was breached, and period. And that's something that people will speculate and have theories on, and maybe someday we'll find out. But what I did notice, General, which was interesting, is this was not break in the SolarWinds and change the source code. CrowdStrike's doing the investigation there, and they've done a great job publishing the details. The hackers altered the build server, the MS or the Microsoft build server, so that when the source code went to get compiled, so that means the source code, if you did a source code review, it looks perfect. During the compilation process, the latest stage before you go to production with your code was when the implant was injected. And we saw the threat actors do a dry run in October of 2019. they injected innocuous code into a production version of SolarWinds. Nobody noticed that. And then in March of 2020 is when the malicious implants are first starting to appear in SolarWinds. And we didn't detect it and go public with it till December 13th. And we only detected it a couple of days prior to that. And I just want to be clear that this implant, there is no magic wand that finds implants in third-party software. So this is a major issue. There's a lot of people that confuse vulnerabilities in software with an implant in software. It wasn't that SolarWinds was vulnerable. It had an embedded implant that had a feature that opened up the SolarWinds server to backdoor access. So it's far more difficult to detect, and we would not have found it till we had exhausted every investigative lead, and we were still sitting there going, so how did they break into FireEye? And I remember on a Monday talking to some folks saying, it's got to be the SolarWinds server. It's our earliest evidence of compromise. And for like 2 days, our malware reversers really didn't feel like going through, 16 gigabytes of a platform. They actually had to be herded and forced into reverse the platform. There's nothing else it can be. See what you can find. And what we learned in that process is, as big as that process sounds, you can do it. And you decompile and you look for programs that open up sockets and things of that nature. So we found the implant in about 2 days once we started looking, a little bit sooner than that. And then just as a aside, our least experienced malware person looking into the SolarWinds platform actually found the implant. So I thought that was funny too. All the guys that have been doing it for 20 years, just luck of the draw, they picked the wrong files to decompile and review. But once we found the implant, we recognized right away, and I think we knew all along, FireEye was one of many victims. I think the day I was briefed on this, General, I remember thinking the number in my head was weird. I just was like, we're probably the 40th pick on the list. There's no way FireEye's number one. Where else are they right now? When we found the implant, I was very convinced that it was probably the government that was predominantly in harm's way.
Now you have, and I have also been public advocates of a process for confidential reporting of hacks by companies, ideally mandatory, to a government organization, which presumably then uses that and through a network shares that information with others at the speed of light, or the speed of hacking at the very least, so that others can see if they have verified that they have been hacked, haven't make whatever changes are necessary, upload new threat forms and so forth. Mm-hmm. What would that be given to CISA nowadays? Would it need a different organization? How would you describe the organizational architecture and process for this, if you will?
The great thing about being a cyber nerd is I don't have to care about, well, I do care about diplomacy and the government, but regardless of the agency chartered with doing it, you will have to have a clearinghouse for intel that's a single point. You just do. I don't care what you call it, but it's got to be private and public sector thing. And it's similar to what General Alexander's thinking with the Iron Dome concept. And I heard Kelly Bissell say the same thing, and Andrew was saying the same thing earlier today as well, that we need to have situational awareness, and you can't get that when every company is doing cybersecurity all by themselves. It just doesn't happen. So, when I was talking to the Senate Intelligence Committee a couple of months ago, we were saying things we were saying in the 90s. If you respond to unauthorized, unlawful, or unacceptable behavior professionally in cyber, you are a first responder. If you are a first responder, you should have a pretty damn good clue as to what you're dealing with at every single breach you're responding to. And that intel needs to get into the hands of a clearinghouse that can push it. The bigger issue will be, and I think that'll happen, we will get a clearinghouse. It'll probably be CISA, and there will be mandatory threat intelligence sharing, not necessarily mandatory disclosure from the actual victim company. But that's okay because you can defend the nation with the intel. I'm not convinced, though, you can take the intel and always push the intel everywhere. I think that we may have to come up with a system where you protect certain critical infrastructure, first you probably protect the government, then you protect government and critical infrastructure. Probably the third stage, when we get more mature and more capable, is at network speed, you protect everything else. But we got to take any step in the right direction. And I am very convinced we can do better than how we're doing today as a nation.
Well, certainly the Cyberspace Solarium Commission that reported out last year had a lot of great recommendations. They're gradually putting them into law, into authorization and appropriations. There were a number of them in the big bill that was passed at the end of this past year. And again, we'll hear what the acting director of CISA has to say about this later on this afternoon. You talked briefly about the differences between Russian and Chinese exploitation of hacks. One is fairly rapier-like, it's quite targeted. The other is vacuum it all up and then figure out how to aggregate it later on to identify spies or whatever. Talk a bit about also, say, North Korean and Iranian. How do all of these differ?
Yeah, I can tell you first and foremost, I've noticed no one knows where the border of acceptability is. So it's almost like you find it after you cross it. So the rules of engagement got wobbly. In my career, I can speak best to Chinese and Russian-based intrusion sets because that's what I personally did my 20,000 hours responding to from 1995 till, really about 2013, every single day. And we saw, for example, General, in 2015, lots of changes with what Russia was doing, where it used to be every time we caught them, they would just go away, and they changed 4 things. We'd catch them, and by the way, they always know when we catch them. It was never lost on me that the endpoint software that we used to investigate was called MIR, or Mandia Intelligent Response, which in Russian means peace. It was almost our way of saying, we think you're really good at this. We acknowledge that you're good at this. But they'll see us installing our agent and know that an entity's responding. And but all of a sudden, in August of 2015, we were responding to a breach. And most of my frontline responders knew. I never really got to observe them when I was in the military. It was like magic. Every time we knew they were there, we get to see like 1 day's worth of activity, and that was it. And they never came back. And we're like, you got to be kidding me. They knew we had a sensor. They knew we were on the endpoint. They saw our investigation. Or we whack-a-mole a little bit and they said, we don't want our TTPs to be observed. They stopped that in 2015, and we don't know why. It's same month, they hacked a couple of universities, and that was odd for me in that they always hacked universities for R&D, but then they hacked into these universities and stole the email of certain anti-Putin professors. And I went, China does it all the time. So the long story made short, over the last few years, I think Russia's pushed the envelope a little bit to see where the line is, and nobody knows where that red line is for espionage. And China really surprised me with the spray and pray they did really February 25th to 28th of this year when they had the 0 days for exchange. Because we both know if you have a 0 day, you're going to use it relatively precisely for a long time. And you're not going to carpet bomb the internet with a 0 day unless you want to get caught. And I think because Microsoft was coming up with a patch in March, and they did so on March 2nd, somehow the Chinese threat actors recognized the patch was coming, and they carpet bombed and hit over 100,000 systems. That's going to get noticed. I mean, at some point, we're going to find this thing. It's no longer a needle in the haystack. The whole damn haystack now is a needle, and that's what they did there. That surprised me. And I'm not sure why they went that broad. It just didn't seem in character with what I'd witnessed for 20-something years. North Korea, I cannot predict. I do believe they do hack to make money, and they're probably the only modern nation. I think China doesn't, Russia doesn't. I think Russia will condone, well, they obviously condone ransomware actors. In fact, they'd probably promote it and share in the profits. But North Korea will hack for money and for gain. Iran is the one that's improved the most. And I can tell you, we first responded to Iran in 2008. And the way we knew we were responding to Iran is, quite frankly, someone in the government kind of tapped us on the shoulder and said, hey, you're responding at so-and-so, that's Iran. And we said, oh, that's interesting. But they were right out of the classroom is probably the best way to describe it. And the example I always give is they hacked into a state, and they did hack into a certain industry popular in Texas. But while we were responding, we saw them come in and they stole the whole C drive. That was their data exfil. Let's compress the operating system, the icons, and steal it all. And that's beyond amateur hour. They are not amateurs anymore. They have ex-agent-based capability. They can adapt very quickly. And I truly believe we haven't seen any of these nations absolute top game. I don't think we have. What we don't know is, are we seeing 90% of their capability or 70? Without a doubt, the most improvement, now I feel like we're at a sports assembly. The most improved hacker award would go to Iran. They are literally, I think Russia's here. I think China's probably one notch down, and Iran, I think Iran's probably the same as China right now. It's close.
That's pretty extraordinary. As we come to the end of this, let me ask just one last question, if I could. You told the Cyber Brief during a briefing last year that 2020 was the year of ransomware.
Yep.
Of course, that was before the SolarWinds hack, but ransomware certainly hasn't gone away. It continues to cause particular problems for the healthcare industry, local governments, various other targets that don't have the kind of comprehensive cybersecurity that is needed.
Right.
What do you think you'll look back in 2021, and are there any emerging titles that you are developing for it just yet?
I think, General, the most intolerable thing happening right now is ransomware. There is no nation that doesn't despise it. And it's amazing to me that we allow several nations to harbor the operators. The UK doesn't like it. India doesn't like it. Japan hates it. Australia hates it. We hate it. And unfortunate part of my job is talking to CEOs dealing with extortion and ransomware. And it's hard to pitch a perfect game in security every single day. So I know I've heard the security purists go, if you just do good hygiene, ransomware won't work. It's going to work at every single company over time if we allow it. The actors are getting better and better. For example, there is a company called Excellion, and they had a file transfer system, or FTA, that had a 0-day in it. A 0-day being exploited by ransomware actors. That really happened. That is not fiction. There's at least 100 victims to that. And the ransomware actors are ruthless. And so I still think 2020 was the worst year to be a CISO. 2021, I feel like I'm not a fear, uncertainty, and doubt person, but there's never been more compromise than right now on the internet, in my opinion. We're at full bore responding to breaches. As we sit here on this call right now, General, we're responding to over 160 security breaches. And we only go to the ones where the breach is at a scale and scope where people need help. And by the way, we get inbounds every day. So everyone who responds to breaches knows what I'm talking about. I'm sure Kelly Bissell and his team's outrageously busy. All the teams are. And we're just playing defense all the time, and the puck's getting in the net. I think 2021 will be a year of ransomware. Billions of dollars will leave the nation. You've heard earlier that Bitcoin is here to stay. It's not going to go away. I think somebody said that. All these anonymous currencies are enabling the transfer of wealth that's happening with ransomware. So long story made short, 2021 right now is shaping up to be another tough year. And I'd give it 4 themes. You got Russia doing things like implants. That's frustrating. That's genuine espionage. You have China now spray and pray attacks. That's unfortunate. We don't want to deal with that. So you have the modern nations kind of flexing a little bit in cyber. And then you have the ransomware actors. So it's just those 2.
Just as an aside on ransomware, still desirable to have a separate backup data that is somehow unconnected except for specific activities?
Yeah, there's no question. We're now seeing ransomware, and we're tracking it from the moment the actors break in to the moment they're actually doing an encryptor deployment, can be upwards of 50 days. By the way, that number's coming down, down, and down. But in the first stage, they're stealing your credentials. They're doing internal reconnaissance. They're escalating privileges. They're doing lateral movement. They're obtaining what they need to steal your data. But in that first stage, they may start deleting backups. But obviously, if you have backups and you can do recovery, and I call that general red lever event, imagine that every machine becomes inoperable. How fast would you be back up and running? And that's a red lever event. Another one is come off the internet and see how you perform your business. But the second one would be pull the red lever, every machine's encrypted. How fast would you get back up and running? And I don't recommend anybody really do that. But what you do is say, here's the 100 apps that are most important and most critical. Let's at least back that up. And so many, and by the way, second stage is data theft. They steal something that matters to extort you to be paid because their ultimate goal is to get paid. And step 3 is in fact the encryptors. So right now, it's almost like in those movies where you see someone grab a phone and go, sell, 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 sell now. We have managed defense customers where we have to call them up. You're pre-ransomware. They're in. You know, we've got to do something now. You're in a foot race, especially at a big organization, from that stage 1 to stage 3. I've never, you know, it's gotten down to the point where at some places you've got like 30 minutes is the fastest I've heard of, where from the moment they're getting in to deploying ransomware was 30 minutes. So, and still the number one way in is spear phishing. They still are spear phishing end users, and there's no solution I'm aware of, or at least it's not widely deployed if it exists, that detects every spear phish.
So the truly last question, if you were the director of CISA, or perhaps the now restored White House cybersecurity czar, or even the new national cyber officer that is being established, that position, what would be your top 3 priorities?
First and foremost, get attribution right. If you don't know who's doing it, you cannot proportionately respond. So that's always number 1, because I don't know, people are struggling with defining the red line, General, but we'll know it when we see it and when it's crossed. So I would say number 1 in that role, always get attribution right. Whatever means necessary, know who's attacking us so that you can proportionally respond. 2, I would actually communicate doctrine so we have rules of the road. And I think that's really hard for espionage because of the natural asymmetry. North Korea is not going to beat us with tanks, but hey, in cyber, they get, you know, glass house versus mud hut, and they like those odds. We're in the glass house and they're in the mud hut in cyber. So that's good odds for them. But I would communicate doctrine and look for a way to really pin down the criminal elements that are being condoned on the internet, period. And that's going to be tough, but I would have a doctrine on how we want to handle that, and there'd be lots of international cooperation on that. The third thing I would do is absolutely make sure we can defend the nation in cyber better than we can today. And that's probably got sub bullets to it, but it would start with an absolute mandatory threat intelligence sharing, not disclosure law, but threat intel sharing law, that you have to provide data that can help safeguard the nation. If you're a first responder, for sure. And I think that would go a long way, where you could go shields up for a lot of organizations, and they won't even know it, you know, because you'll have the big firewall companies, you'll have the endpoint companies that are large and have coverage, and you'll have the ISPs or providers informed in a way that can help defend the nation.
Well, it'll be great to hear the acting CISA director's thoughts on how achievable that is. With that, Suzanne, I know that you, I think, have been gathering questions from the audience. If I can tag team with you, I will let you lead on with the further interrogation.
Rick and I are so happy to tag team. What a fantastic conversation, General. Thank you so much. I actually have a question for the both of you, which is, you know, we in the sort of journalism world have heard some rumors and rumblings that this might be a week when there is a US government response to the SolarWinds hack. I wonder what your immediate feeling on something like that might be. Kevin, you mentioned, you know, when you're talking with CEOs, there's this brace for impact feeling. if there's a retaliation, how do you feel about advising companies and protecting your own company if something like that occurs?
You know, the challenge, Suzanne, with all that is when a nation targets a company, the nation wins. And if any company out there is thinking, you know what, I'll take on the SVR, you don't want it. It's like getting in the ring with Andre the Giant. You're not going to have a pretty fight. And so we got to think long and hard about what is the outcome we want, and does whatever we do get us to that outcome. But I don't wish for any company to have to withstand the intent and targeting of a modern foreign intelligence service. They will lose over time.
Let me just add, I think it's very important to have what you might describe as both public and, in a sense, private responses. There has to be some degree of public response just because that's going to be required. Domestic politics will force that, even if you're inclined against that. And in this case, I think certainly there has to be some of that. So there should be some individual sanctions levied. There can be some bans on individuals. There could actually be court cases and so forth. But I'm actually a bigger fan of the kind of private activity, some of which has come to surface, such as during the 2018 midterm elections, where Cybercom/NSA essentially let the Russians know that we know what you're doing and you need to know that we know that, and oh, by the way, we're going to shut you down and disrupt you and take a toll on what you're able to do in the final days of that particular election. And my recollection is we didn't actually announce that or make that public for quite some time. And I'm not sure it wasn't even made public perhaps by those that had a political imperative to make it public rather than, say, Cybercom and NSA. I'm a real fan of those kinds of activities. In fact, when I was the commander at Central Command and also the director of the CIA, we occasionally would literally sit around and say, what could we do, just as an example, say to Iran, if Iran does something that's egregious, what could we do that is really, it's not 100% clear to them that we did it, but they probably think that we did it. We don't announce that we did it, but they will know that we know that they know that we did it. I mean, it's this kind of thinking that, you know, there's just this oil platform that just sort of noses over and sort of does a nosedive into the Gulf. And again, no public activity at all about that action. Maybe there can be on some other things. And again, it seems to me that there's an awful lot of value in that. It also, by the way, hopefully sort of stops the escalation spiral so that you don't go back and forth and they feel compelled because you did something really substantial publicly. They must now respond, and then we have to respond. And if, you know, if they kill some of ours, then we have a real challenge on our hands. And my sense is that that is appreciated in the cyber world, and that could be a feature. I don't know if we can get something out of the CISA director later on today, but it's certainly worth asking just to see if there could be some hint that that would be an approach that would be part of the response. Because again, I think in something that is so significant as SolarWinds, there has to be a public response as well. And I was on a session with a very senior person in the White House this morning who acknowledged it. Look, you know, get over it. Foreign policy is very heavily influenced on a daily basis by domestic policy issues and concerns, and it should be. Presidents do have to do politics, as much as generals may dislike that from time to time.
Rick, do you have a question as well?
Yeah, I did actually. Kevin, General, thanks for your talk and for being here. It's great stuff. I would ask both of you, and Kevin, this is a little bit of an out-of-body experience for you, I think, more so than General Petraeus, and that is, given the way that SolarWinds happened, what would you do to prevent future SolarWinds attacks from a policy point of view? What are the things that you would say we should do to prevent that sort of thing?
I always say 4-star generals first. So General Petraeus.
Well, I believe that some of this, and actually, Rick, I'd be interested in your view because you're the most recent of the professional former government officials in this particular forum. But it seems to me that a lot of this comes back to the sharing aspect of things. And again, I'm a huge fan. I was a big public advocate of an organization like CISA. Happy to see it formed initially underneath DHS, so they do the backroom stuff and all the admin and finance and everything else. But it's going to have a sufficiently high profile and a sufficiently direct link to Congress, to the authorizers and the appropriators, so that it can get done what it does. And I still see it as very incomplete, despite the great job that Chris Krebs did bringing it online and especially monitoring the elections this past year. It clearly is just still nowhere near what it needs to be. And I think that there is a component of that at some point, Rick, has to rival that of NSA. But right now, if some aspiring cyber star in college has a choice between going to NSA or DHS, where are they going to go? They know you can do stuff that's illegal anywhere else if you go to NSA. They're not quite so sure CISA is still a new object and so forth. But it seems to me that if CISA is going to be the quarterback for all of this, for all of the departments and agencies that have oversight of critical infrastructure elements, sectors, and they're establishing the policy and overseeing the implementation of those departments and so forth, while doing some themselves, such as election oversight, that they've got to have a much, much bigger purview of operations, including lots of plugs from NSA. In an ideal world, if we didn't have the fact that NSA is primarily an overseas intelligence organization, I would have loved to have seen CISA formed in the same way that the UK formed their cybersecurity agency, which is literally half of it is from GCHQ, and the other half is sort of civilians from outside or elsewhere in government, and is a very, very innovative way of doing it. And they have a formal chain of command link with GCHQ as well. You just you can't borrow that number from NSA, I don't think, with a straight face. Or without having some oversight for Congress. But that's the kind of issue they're going to have to, because again, this comes back to, if you really want to prevent this, you're going to have much broader sharing, and you're going to have the world's best then doing the kind of forensics and identification and everything else. So that it's not just some great hero in FireEye stumbles across this. There should be something that is more formal than that, with, again, great recognition of what FireEye had to say. But Kevin, over to you. And then Rick, we want to hear you on this issue, actually.
Yeah, I think I forgot the question, General Petraeus.
How do you prevent SolarWinds?
You have to have risks or repercussions. If you don't, it'll just continue to happen. So we got to think about, and to me, that means you got to have some loose communication of doctrine that still allows you to have flexibility in how you respond. And I do believe having global rules for espionage will always be complicated because you have enemies that won't follow rules, but I still think it's worth a shot. Deterrence outside of cyber is a good thing to help us. And we're going through a gap right now. You heard Kelly Bissell. I agreed with what he said. We're going through the 70 products, and they're supposed to loosely defend a company. 10 years from now, I think cybersecurity is going to be more like the utility business. We all needed electricity over time. We just subscribe to it. We will mature over time to having fewer, larger security providers delivering the outcomes that are better than what we're delivering doing it alone. While we're getting to that future where we'll do better, I feel you have to bridge that gap with deterrence.
Yeah, I think those are both right, and I also think that there's something in the slightly more technical area where you've got the way software is built today is people get modules from different places and they put it together. That's how you build a billion lines of code. You don't write a billion lines of code. You assemble a billion lines of code. And there's something to the software bill of materials idea where someone validates the modules, and then you take validated modules and put them together, and then you run security again, because when you put two things that work well together, you introduce the chance that they do something unexpected, and you have to prevent that. But at least it gets you out of the supply chain sort of attack. And the second thing, I think, is some sort of rationalization of the environment, because you've got 80 different tools that people are using, or whatever the number is. And everybody wants to simplify things, but when you simplify, when you concentrate, you increase vulnerability. And so there's a trade-off there, where do I need one software piece of software that manages my network, or do I need a choice of 5 or 10? So it's a combination of simplification and diversification, and you need both. And the answer is, what's the right level? I think that's something where the government might be able to help in terms of standardization, maybe through the NIST or something like that.
And again, certainly a combination of defense on the one hand and deterrence on the other clearly is, in the biggest of pictures, is absolutely required.
Gentlemen, I was just going to ask you for any closing thoughts before we wind down this hour. I mean, what a fantastic conversation. I've been furiously taking notes on everything. And again, this is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel. And then we're going to put together kind of a summary brief, an executive summary of today's discussion as well. But any closing thoughts to leave us with as we look forward to another 2 days of conversations on these issues? How can we know we're making progress? Kevin?
Well, I think you're going to see progress. We have a new administration. I'm apolitical, but at the end of the day, I feel the line of toleration has been crossed. We're going to do something, and whatever it is, it's going to be better than doing nothing. I actually believe that. And the sometimes perfect is the enemy of the good. You've heard ideas like threat intel sharing, a centralized clearinghouse like CISA. You're going to hear from the acting CISA director. We're going to get better as a nation in defending ourselves. We're going to get better as companies defending ourselves. And I do believe over the next few years, you're going to see the ability to get more rules of engagement, especially outside of espionage, between nations to address the ransomware problem. We can't always just be thinking defense, defense, defense. We will start imposing risks and repercussions to those who are taking advantage of the vulnerabilities that we all have.
Mm-hmm.
I think the closing thought is one that is pretty widely agreed now, but was not even just a few years ago. And that is that CEOs actually have to be into the cybersecurity business, not just the CISO or the IT people or what have you, in a very, very serious way, with lots of oversight. The boards there have to be metrics, there should be real standards and so forth. And that no single product is going to assure you of good cybersecurity. They certainly won't be if you just bolt them all on. I happen to be, now I'm on the cybersecurity side of things. Of course, I used to enjoy being at least the recipient of the breaking and entering crowd fruits of their labor. But with that background and the awareness of what can be done, and Keith Alexander obviously was a very close comrade during those years that we were doing all this stuff, including literally building the first cloud, I think, in the military in Baghdad, because we couldn't push all the data back through the pipes. Rick will recall this well, and the real-time regional gateway was a huge breakthrough and brought the applications engineers out there. But with an awareness of all of that, I'm very, very convinced that the answer has to be a designed for each firm. You can have a generic standard, if you will, reference architecture, but a designed, comprehensive, integrated, and managed cybersecurity solution that includes sort of all of the above items, but they have to be integratable and all work together. In fact, so I'm on the board of Optiv. That is the big idea behind that. FireEye is one of the big partners of Optiv. But I think Kevin would acknowledge that FireEye is best used if it's part of this overarching, again, comprehensive approach that is designed for a firm, made bespoke from a reference architecture, and then operated, even if FireEye provides a number of the different capabilities and products, if you will, that are required for that. That, I think, I'm just convinced of that. And it has to constantly be updated as better products come online or product improvements come online. And then ideally you get to this idea that you're sharing not just, again, all of the endpoints and devices and everything else that that particular network has touching it, but all other networks that you can get to be incorporated in this in some fashion, so that again, there is much more real-time sharing of threats that are identified, patches, et cetera, required actions and all the rest. The big question on that is at the national level, what should that organizational architecture look like? What should the authorities be for, again, if it is CISA that is to do that? And if it is, then we need to provide them considerable additional appropriations to go with the authorizations, because they're by no means yet what would be necessary to do that. And if you can't use NSA for that purpose, and you know, we were sort of trying to do that at one point in time before the Snowden revelations, then clearly CISA is going to have to become the domestic equivalent of NSA. And that's a long effort, but it needs to get going in a serious way.
Yeah, Rick, anything closing?
Just thanks, Kevin, General. That was fantastic.
Our pleasure, and thanks to you, Rick.
Really great conversation, gentlemen. Thank you so much. We look forward to keeping in touch on these issues. We can't hit these once a year and let it go and go from conference to conference. So we're looking for ways that we can keep this thread going. So thank you both so much for participating. We very much appreciate hearing from you today. I hope you're able to stick around and listen as we interview Brandon Wales, the Acting Director of CISA, in just a few moments.